After 26 years of loyalty, they fired me without warning, but they had no idea the contract they forgot would destroy everything. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I just walked away quietly, and brought down their empire in silence. My name is Walter Kent. I'm 61 years old, and for the last 26 years, I've lived in the shadows of a factory that bore another man's name but thrived on my sweat. Wexler components. Wasn't mine, but it might as well have been. I knew every bolt, every press, every face on that floor better than I knew my reflection. I wasn't the man shaking hands at trade expos or getting plaques from local chambers. I was the one making sure the machines didn't break, the orders didn't stall, and the workers didn't leave. Harold Wexler used to say, "Walter, when you're in charge, I sleep better," and that meant more to me than any paycheck ever could. He was old school, rough hands, sharp eyes, a man who built his company with nothing but scrap and resolve. We didn't always agree, but there was respect, and when his hands started trembling and the coughs came deeper and longer, he called me into his office and said, "It's your floor now. Walter, watch over it like it's yours, until Connor finds his footing." I nodded, maybe a little too firmly, because in my bones, I already knew Connor wouldn't want my kind of footing. Connor Wexler was 33 when he slid into his father's chair. 5 months later, he was calling me into a conference room, a place I'd never once been summoned before. I walked in. He didn't look up. His fingers kept moving across his laptop like I was a delivery he hadn't ordered. He didn't offer a seat, didn't say my name, just leaned back, laced his fingers behind his head, and said, "We need to modernize, Walter, streamline, you understand, right? We just can't have guys clinging to the past slowing us down." It was a cliché dressed in a silk tie. No thank you, no handshake, no mention of the men I trained who now ran entire departments, no nod to the fact I'd worked 13 straight Christmas Eves to make sure shipments went out on time, just corporate detachment in human form. I felt something unravel in me quietly, like the sound of thread snapping deep in a coat collar. I stood there, took a slow breath, and said, "You'll have my badge by noon." He smiled like I'd just confirmed a merger. He leaned forward, said, "Good man," and then went back to his screen as if I were already gone. And in a way, I was. I drove home in silence, no radio, no thoughts, just the weight of 26 years shrinking into a single box on the passenger seat filled with my nameplate, my gloves, and a photo of Alice taped to my locker door. Alice had been gone 5 years, cancer, quiet and cruel, the way it steals and leaves nothing but blankets that still smell like shampoo and letters you can't throw away. Sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring across the wood grain, the same one we'd picked out on our 10th anniversary, back when I still had hair and she still left lipstick on coffee mugs. That table had become my office, my dining hall, my grief counselor. I sat there for a long while staring at my hands. They looked old now, older than I remembered. Eventually I stood, walked to the filing cabinet in the den, and pulled out the accordion folder marked WK Employment. It was dusty, untouched for years. I flipped through contracts, memos, training certificates, until something caught my eye, a clause dated 2008, a contract amendment Harold had insisted on back when the company was nearly sold to a private equity firm. In the event of a termination not explicitly documented as cause, the employee shall be entitled to severance equal to 24 months of current base salary, in addition to all accrued retirement contributions, stock options, and performance bonuses as recorded in the 5 most recent fiscal years. I reread it 3 times. Harold had said, "If they ever try to push you out, they'll have to pay what you're worth." At the time, I'd thought it was just another way of saying thank you. But now it was something else entirely. It was leverage. It was armor. It was a slow-burning fuse in a very expensive room. I called Martin Blake, a labor attorney I'd met during Alice's chemo treatments. Sharp eyes, no patience for nonsense. He answered on the second ring. "Walter," said, voice familiar and warm. "What can I do for you?" I told him everything, every word Connor had said, the contract clause, every document I still had in my possession. He chuckled, low and long. "Walter, this is gold. You could walk into mediation tomorrow and walk out with a check that starts with a 3. I didn't want revenge. I told him I wanted recognition. I wanted to be seen, not erased. He said, "I'll draft the letter clean, simple, no threats, just a reminder of what they forgot to read." 3 days later, Wexler Components received the letter, and for a while, there was nothing, just silence, and I'd lived with silence since Alice died. I knew its shape and weight. This was different. This silence was scared. It was strategizing. On the 4th day, a thin letter arrived from their legal department, evasive and vague. Pretending they hadn't seen the clause, I handed it to Martin, who barely glanced before filing the complaint in county court. And just like that, it wasn't about a contract anymore. It was about age discrimination, wrongful termination, breach of loyalty. Connor called me himself 2 days later, voice tight like someone trying to smile through broken glass. "Walter, this is all a misunderstanding," he said. "We can offer 6 months severance and a glowing letter of recommendation." I didn't laugh, though I wanted to. Instead, I said, "Connor, read section 11.4 again. I'm not looking for charity, I'm looking for what I'm owed." There was a long pause. Then his voice sharpened. "You'll never work in this industry again. Walter, no one wants a bitter old man stirring up lawsuits." "Funny," I said. "I already got 2 offers, one from a competitor, the other from a startup co-founded by someone I trained 10 years ago. Turns out when you lead with integrity, people remember, and they call the next morning." I poured my coffee, leaned back in my chair, and watched the snow start to fall outside gently, softly, and relentless. It reminded me of Alice, how she used to say snow is just silence made visible. I didn't tell anyone what was happening, not yet. I didn't want pity or applause, I just wanted truth to stand on its weight. I went for walks, visited Alice's grave, reread old books I'd forgotten on shelves, all while waiting for the world I'd helped build to realize what it had done. The best revenge is not looking back, not fighting, not even speaking. It's silence and time, and preparation. The storm hadn't even started, yet mornings came slow and thick like syrup. I'd never noticed how long a day could stretch without a factory bell or a schedule to chase. There were no shifts to oversee, no reports to sign off. Just hours that passed without direction and an inbox slowly filling with questions I'd never thought I'd hear. "Are you available for consulting? Would you consider a short-term contract? We heard about the Wexler transition and thought of you." It was odd being wanted after being discarded like a part gone obsolete. I didn't reply. Right away I was still learning how to live without the hum of conveyor belts and the crackle of radios in my ear. I spent hours sorting old tools, oiling them, placing them back in drawers I hadn't opened in years, as if organizing my past would somehow shape my future. Martin called just after noon on a Monday. The snow was melting and my window was fogged with steam from the tea kettle. He didn't waste words. Wexler's team blinked. He'd said they want a meeting, not mediation, no court date. Yet just to sit down. I told them we'd consider it on your terms. I said, "What terms?" And he said, "Your chair, your time, your Spencer." Meeting was set for Thursday at the offices of a neutral arbitrator. Clean glass walls, white carpet, the kind of place where even the pens looked expensive. I wore a suit I hadn't touched since Alice's funeral. The sleeves still faintly smelled of her perfume. Or maybe I imagined it. Connor was already there when we arrived, trying to look relaxed. But his knee bounced under the table. His lawyer whispered something he didn't seem to hear. Martin placed the contract on the table, open to the amendment from 2008, his voice calm and deliberate, the silence between each word heavier than the last. "This clause was signed by Harold Wexler, notarized, and filed. It outlines the severance entitlement for Mr. Kent in the event of a termination not attributed to documented cause. This termination had no such documentation." Connor leaned forward. "That clause is obsolete. The business has evolved since then." Martin didn't even blink. "So has the law, and yet the contract remains binding." The arbitrator turned toward Connor's lawyer. "Is this clause acknowledged and active?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "Yes," he said. Barely audible. "It's valid." Then came the second blow. Martin slid forward. A thin folder, copies of internal memos, HR summaries, emails, forwarded to Walter by anonymous employees. Words like restructure, redundancy, legacy mindset. They didn't accuse me directly, but they painted me as old, stubborn, resistant, without once asking me to change or contribute to the very modern vision they claimed to chassis. "Discrimination is a quiet thing," Martin said. "It doesn't yell, it whispers, and it leaves out. And that silence becomes a pattern, and that pattern becomes a case." Connor tried to regain footing from Walter. "We offered you a generous package, 6 months more than fair." "Fair," I said. "For whom you didn't even shake my hand, Connor. You didn't even say my name." There was nothing left to say after that. The arbitrator scheduled formal mediation. Wexler's legal team began backpedaling. Papers were filed. For the first time in years, I went home not tired, not defeated, but clear. That night, I sat on the porch wrapped in Alice's old quilt, the one with the uneven stitching and the coffee stain shaped like Michigan. I watched the stars break through the dark one by one, and I thought of something she'd once told me during chemo, when her hair was falling out in clumps and we didn't know how to talk about the fear. "Walter," she said, "sometimes you don't have to fight like a soldier. Sometimes you fight like a mountain, just by staying." And so I stayed. I didn't run, I didn't beg. I let truth do the heavy lifting. Weeks passed. The mediation loomed closer. Wexler's silence grew louder. Then one morning, I got a call from Danny Madsen, a senior engineer who'd worked under me for nearly a decade. He said, "Walter, I gave notice." Today I asked why he paused. "Connor doesn't listen, he talks, but he doesn't hear. The floor is falling apart and I can't be part of it anymore that night." Another call from Jenna Ruiz, another resignation, another engineer gone. Same reason. Didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just felt something shifting, like the ground was giving way beneath the tower they'd built too fast on bones they didn't respect. Meanwhile, Martin finalized our terms. Full severance, all owed bonuses and stock vestments, back pay, and a formal apology that I didn't ask for, but he insisted we include it. Not for ego, he said. For the record. The paperwork was filed quietly, headlines avoided, but whispers spread through Akron's tight industrial circle, and people began to call more than before, not with pity but with interest. Respect, curiosity. One offer stood out: a small firm on the edge of town, Anchor Dynamics, 3 engineers, all ex-Wexler employees. One of them, Abby T, a woman I'd trained 15 years ago when she was the only female technician on the line. Fierce, sharp. She once rebuilt a press machine with nothing but elbow grease and attitude. She said, "Walter, we don't want to hire you. We want you to join us as a partner. Equal say, equal stake. We're building something that doesn't forget where it came from." I said, "Let's meet." "I'm listening." We met at a diner over lukewarm coffee and plans sketched on napkins. They had vision, energy, but they lacked grounding. They needed someone who'd weathered storms, not just drawn blueprints. I said I wouldn't micromanage, but I wouldn't disappear either. They agreed, and just like that, I wasn't retired. I was reborn. Mediation day came and went. Wexler settled quietly. The check was large but not life-changing. The apology letter came unsigned but typed cleanly, and I framed it not for pride but as proof. As an anchor 6 months after Connor fired me, I walked into Anchor Dynamics not as a visitor, not as a relic, but as a partner. I shook hands with the TM, drank stale office coffee, and stared at the schematics of our first major contract. It was a logistics deal, the kind Wexler used to own, until their delays and talent drain cost them the renewal. I signed the agreement myself. Slowly and deliberately. Connor never called again, but someone else did. A number I hadn't dialed in years. A voice I hadn't heard since before Alice got sick. Rachel, Alyssa's younger sister. Widowed now. Quiet voice, but a bright mind. She'd stayed in touch after the funeral, but life had made distance grow. She called to say she saw my name in a local article. Quiet feature on comeback stories. "Walter," she said, "you always knew how to stay grounded." We talked for an hour, then 2, then coffee was suggested. And coffee turned into long walks, and long walks into something I didn't yet know how to name, but felt like warmth returning to a room I thought would stay cold forever. And through it all, I never once raised my voice, because sometimes strength isn't about omit. It's about knowing when to stand still and let others fall, not by your hand but by their momentum. I didn't see it happen all at once. The fall of Wexler Components wasn't an explosion, it was erosion. Slow, steady, quiet, like water wearing down steel from the inside out. By the time the headlines caught up, the damage was already woven into the foundation. It started with the contract, the one Anchor Dynamics landed 6 months after I joined. They called it a small win. I called it a signal, because the client had once been loyal to Wexler for over a decade, but supply delays, engineering missteps, and 3 missed inspections had pushed them toward alternatives, and when they found us they didn't hesitate. Abby called me the morning after we signed it, her voice cracking with equal parts joy and disbelief. "Walter, they didn't even ask for a discount. They just said thank you and sent the specs." Connor didn't call, but I knew he knew. 2 weeks later, word spread that another senior engineer had left, this one from Connor's executive circle, someone I barely knew but who once shadowed me during a safety systems overhaul. He left a 2-line resignation letter citing misalignment of values and diminishing operational trust. I read it twice, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I already felt. Connor had thought the future was built by force. But the truth is, legacy isn't inherited, it's earned, and he'd never taken the time to understand the ground he stood on. The Wexler name used to mean reliability. Now it was starting to mean rotation, turnover, missed benchmarks. My phone didn't stop ringing, not just from competitors or recruiters, but from old coworkers wanting to talk, to vent, to ask where I'd gone, what I was doing, if there was room for them. Toei never turned anyone away, not out of revenge, but because I remembered what it felt like to be discarded without a second thought. Martin called again, not for legal matters, but to ask a favor. His niece was graduating from engineering School, top of her class, wanted to intern somewhere that wasn't stuck in the past. I told him to send her over. We'll make room. That was the thing about Anchor Dynamics. We weren't perfect, but we listened. We built from the ground up. And no one ever raised their voice to be heard. Meanwhile, Connor made headlines for a different reason. An article in the Akron Business Review asked a pointed question at the end of a feature on rising startup culture: is legacy a gift or a burden? The writer didn't name me directly, but the article cited anonymous sources within Wexler who spoke of a culture shift that had silenced experience in favor of disruption. Connor fired back with a press release, all buzzwords and performance graphs, but it didn't answer the question. It just circled IT Reddit while sipping tea in the workshop, sunlight pouring across blueprints of a prototype we were building for a logistics startup. Young founder, hungry but humble, reminded me of myself before time carved out the noise. Came by later that afternoon with apple pie and silence. She had a way of entering a room that didn't feel like arrival, more like continuatio, like the next chapter had been waiting for her handwriting. We sat on the porch, the pie untouched, the birds loud in the trees, and she asked a question I hadn't let myself answer in months. Do you miss it? The floor, the noise, the routine. I thought about it, thought about it. I miss what it used to be, I said. Not what it became. She nodded, and we stayed there a long time saying nothing, because sometimes silence isn't absence. It's presence too full for words. That night, I got a message from an old friend inside Wexler, someone still trying to hold the place together. He didn't say much, just sent a photo of an empty locker, the one that used to belong to Danny the engineer, who'd resigned earlier. It had a post-it on the door with one word written in red ink, Anchor. I stared at that word for a long time. Connor didn't just lose employees. He lost gravity, the kind that keeps teams rooted and purpose-focused, and when that goes, everything else follows. 3 weeks later, the board released a short, polite statement thanking Connor for his service and announcing a temporary leadership transition while a search began for a new CEO the same day. Abby slid into my office, her eyes wide, laptop in hand. Look at this, she said. The logistics company that dropped Wexler just doubled our contract volume and offered a retention bonus. I smiled, not because of the money, but because we'd built something solid, not flashy, not loud, just real. Rachel joined us that weekend for a company BBQ, her first time meeting the team. She brought lemonade that reminded me of Alice's recipe, tangy, too sweet, too strong, and just right. Abby pulled me aside as the sun dipped behind the tree. You know, she said, they're calling us the company that rose from the ashes. I told her we didn't rise. We rebuilt, and it wasn't ashes, it was an experience, it was lessons, it was fire that didn't kill, only clarified. It was early spring when the last remnant of my past finally let go. The air still held the bite of winter, but the ground had softened, the kind of weather that makes you believe in starting over, not from scratch, but from something deeper, something rooted. The letter came in a plain envelope, no logo, no signature, just my name typed in small block letters on the front. Inside was a single line written by hand: thank you for never raising your voice. No name, no date, but I knew the handwriting. Harold Wexler, steady, deliberate, like a man carving truth into stone. I didn't show it to anyone, not even Rachel. I folded it once and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, not because I needed it, but because it mattered. A quiet acknowledgement from a man who once said, when you're in charge, I sleep better. Wexler Components didn't die, it restructured, rebranded, and in doing so it vanished, not physically. The building still stood. The machine still hummed, but the soul was gone, the legacy stripped of the names and hands that built it. Now it was just another company chasing relevance with slogans and color palettes. Meanwhile, Anchor Dynamics grew not in headlines or market caps, but in loyalty, in the quiet buzz of a team that believed in each other. We took on 3 more clients, launched 2 product lines, and built our prototype lab by the river in an old rail depot. The bricks still scarred with age, the floor still echoing with stories from decades ago. It felt right, it felt earned. Rachel came by more often, sometimes with pie, with plans, sometimes just with silence. She didn't press, she never had, but one morning, over burnt toast and the Akron Gazette folded on the table, she said something that caught the air like a match to dry wood. Spent your whole life building things, Walter. Maybe it's time to build something that doesn't run on steel and gears. I looked at her the way you look at a sunrise after too many nights, and I said, what do you have in mind? She smiled, the kind of smile that makes you believe in possibility again. I don't know yet, she said. Maybe something softer, maybe something that stays even when the power goes out. I didn't answer right away, but later that night, I found myself digging through an old storage box, not files, not contracts, but photos. Memories, Alice in a red scarf, smiling by a frozen lake. Rachel as a teenager holding a wrench upside down in my laughter frozen in time. The next week I took her to that lake. It had thawed mostly, but the air still smelled of pine and firewood. We sat on a bench wrapped in the same quilt I'd kept since Alice passed, and I told her I wasn't done building. Not factories, not careers, not love. I just needed to learn how to build in a different way. She took my hand. Didn't squeeze, didn't rush. Just held it like a blueprint unrolled with care. Month later, we hosted our first community night at Anchor Dynamics. Not a product launch, not a business pitch, just music, food, stories, a wall of photos, employees. Pass and present, each one tagged with a memory, not a title. One of the younger engineers stood up and pointed to a picture of me from my Wexler days, hair thicker, eyes harder, and said that man taught me how to fix a press blindfolded and still made me feel like I knew what I was doing. I didn't speak that night. Not publicly, I just listened because I'd spent too many years being the voice behind the curtain. Now it was time to let others be heard. That summer Rachel and I took a trip, no itinerary, just a map and a cooler and the open road. We ended up in a small town in West Virginia, where the diner still used paper menus, and the waitress called everyone honey. We stayed 2 nights, then 3, then a week. We talked about maybe buying a cabin, writing our ending, or maybe just turning the page without closing the book on the last night there. We sat under a sky so clear it hurt to blink, stars spread out like spilled salt. And I asked her if she ever thought we'd get here. She said, I didn't think we'd survive the first winter. But you kept showing up every morning like the cold. Didn't matter. I said it did matter. But I showed up anyway. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, that's what love is. Showing up even when it hurts. Back in Akron, the team had things under control. Abby was leading the next phase of expansion, and I quietly stepped back from day-to-day operations, not because I was tired, but because I trusted them, and because I finally understood that leadership isn't about holding on. It's about letting go with grace. I still visited the floor sometimes, just to feel the hum of possibility in the air. I still read reports, still offered ideas, but I no longer needed the title. I was no longer Walter Kent, the floor manager or the partner or the lawsuit. I was just Walter, a man who stayed standing when they expected him to. Afternoon, I passed by the old Wexler building, now operating under a new name, different logos, same walls. I parked across the street just for a moment, just to look. The windows were different now, tinted, the lobby sterile, a far cry from the days when grease and grit meant progress. I didn't feel anger or triumph, just distance, like remembering a song you once loved but no longer needed on your playlist. I drove away slowly, radio off, windows down, air full of cicadas. And somewhere between the traffic lights and the open stretch of road, I realized the suspense was over, not because justice had been served or revenge completed, but because something better had been born, not in courtrooms or contracts, but in every quiet decision to stay kind when I could have been cruel, to teach when I could have walked away, to rebuild when I had every excuse to retire and disappear. The story wasn't about what they took from MIT, was about what they couldn't take. Integrity, purpose, on the ability to love again. That was the real rise.